Welcome back, my friend. If today has been long, heavy, or filled with too many thoughts, then this quiet moment is for you. Before our story begins, give yourself permission to stop carrying the day. You do not need to solve everything tonight. You do not need to answer every worry. For now, simply let the world slow down. Draw the curtains, turn off the bright lights, or let them fade into a softer glow. Rest your body into the bed, loosen your shoulders, unclench your hands, and let your breathing become gentle. Here, we explore the quiet side of history and science, told slowly, softly, and peacefully, so your mind can drift while your body begins to rest. If this is your first time here, please subscribe and join us for more calming stories made for sleep. Now, close your eyes if you wish, settle into the stillness, and let tonight's story carry you away. There are moments in the middle of the ocean when people don't just see water, they see land that isn't there. They hear voices calling their name even when no one is around. Sailors have followed islands that disappeared. Survivors have swum toward ships that never came. Men drifting after the sinking of the USS Indianapolis spoke to people who were not beside them. And the strange part is, they weren't losing their minds. They were trying to survive. Because when the world becomes nothing but water, the human mind begins to create what reality cannot give. Now, imagine this. You are no longer on land. There are no buildings, no sound, no direction, only the horizon stretching endlessly in every direction. And somewhere between what you see and what you begin to believe, the ocean starts to change, not around you, but inside your mind. The raft that should not exist. 1816. Night at sea does not arrive all at once. It does not fall like a curtain or snap into place like a switch being turned off. Instead, it stretches, it lingers. The light fades slowly, almost reluctantly, as if even the sun hesitates to leave a place where there is nothing else to take its place. On land, dusk has context. There are shadows cast by buildings, by trees, by mountains. There are sounds, distant cars, footsteps, wind brushing against walls. But at sea, there is only the horizon, a thin line separating what is real from what might not be. And when that line begins to blur, the mind begins to wander. In the year 1816, a French naval frigate named French frigate Méduse ran aground off the coast of West Africa. It was not a violent storm that caused it. There were no towering waves, no thunder splitting the sky, just a slow, irreversible mistake. The ship drifted too close to a sandbank known as the Bank of Argument and became trapped. At first, there was still order. Officers gave commands. Passengers gathered their belongings. The structure of society, the invisible rules that hold people together, still existed. But the ocean has a way of dissolving those rules quietly and without warning. There were not enough lifeboats. That was the moment everything began to change. A raft was built, not carefully engineered, not meant for survival, but hastily assembled from spare wood, masts, and rope. A platform barely held together, something that was never supposed to carry human life. And yet, 147 people were placed upon it, not because it was safe, but because there was nowhere else for them to go. At first, they believed it would only be temporary. The lifeboats would tow the raft. They would stay together. They would reach shore. That was the plan. And plans at sea often last only as long as hope does. As the raft drifted away from the wreck, it was tied to the lifeboats by ropes, but the raft was heavy, too heavy. The weight of 147 bodies, the uneven structure, the instability, it slowed everything down. And so, one by one, the ropes were cut, not all at once, not announced, just released quietly. The raft was abandoned. At that moment, something invisible snapped, not just the connection to the lifeboats, but the connection to certainty. They were no longer part of a rescue. They were part of the ocean. The first night was still manageable. There was fear, yes, confusion, anger, but also belief. The belief that morning would bring something better. It usually does on land, but the ocean does not follow that rule. By the second day, the sun rose and nothing had changed. No ships on the horizon, no land, no sound except the water moving endlessly in every direction. And that is when the mind begins to fill the silence. At first, it is subtle. Someone thinks they see a shape in the distance, a sail, a shadow. They point, others look. For a moment, they see it too, because the brain does not just process reality, it predicts it. It searches for patterns, and when there are none, it creates them. The ship fades, but the feeling it leaves behind does not. Hope, followed by confusion, then doubt. By the third day, dehydration begins to take hold. The human body is not designed for this. Salt water surrounds them, but cannot be consumed. The sun presses down relentlessly. Skin burns, lips crack, eyes strain against the brightness, and inside the mind, something shifts. Thoughts become slower, less precise. Reality becomes softer, more flexible. One man claims he hears music, not loudly, just faintly, as if carried by the wind, a melody he recognizes, but cannot fully remember. Another begins speaking to someone who is not there. He turns his head, nods, answers questions that no one asked. At first, the others try to correct him. They tell him no one is there, but eventually, they stop because arguing with someone else's reality becomes exhausting when your own is starting to slip. By the fourth day, the line between imagination and perception is no longer clear. A group gathers at one edge of the raft. They are staring into the distance. They say they see land, not a vague shape this time, but something detailed. Trees, a shoreline, movement. Some even describe buildings. They begin to plan. They talk about walking onto the beach, finding water, resting. Their voices grow stronger, more certain, and for a moment it feels real. Others join them because belief is contagious, especially when reality offers nothing better. But the raft continues to drift. The land does not come closer. It does not change, and slowly it dissolves like a dream that disappears the moment you wake up. Only this time, there is no waking up. There is only the ocean. The mind, however, does not stop trying. It cannot, because to stop imagining would be to accept what is happening, and acceptance in that moment would mean surrender. So the brain keeps creating voices in the wind, shapes in the waves, memories that feel like they are happening now. Some begin to relive moments from their past, childhood homes, conversations with loved ones, not as memories, but as experiences, as if time itself has folded, bringing the past into the present. And in a way, that is exactly what is happening. When the external world offers nothing, the internal world expands to fill the space. Days pass, the raft becomes smaller, not physically, but in perception. The ocean feels larger, the sky feels heavier, the horizon feels farther away, and the mind becomes both a refuge and a trap. Because while imagination can provide comfort, it can also lead you away from what little reality remains. Of the 147 people who stepped onto that raft, only 15 would survive. 15. Not because the others were weaker, not because they gave up more easily, but because the ocean does not measure fairness. It does not respond to effort or intention or hope. It simply exists, and in its vast, indifferent presence, the human mind does what it has always done. It tries to make sense of the impossible. It creates meaning where there is none. It builds images, sounds, stories to bridge the gap between what is and what should be. And sometimes those imagined things feel more real than the water beneath their feet. If you listen closely, you can almost understand why. Because in a place where nothing changes, where the horizon never moves, where time stretches endlessly, imagination is not just escape, it is survival. A fragile, flickering light in a world made entirely of water and silence. The Companion Who Wasn't There, 1915. There are places on Earth where silence is not just the absence of sound. It becomes something else, a presence, a weight, something you can almost feel pressing against your skin the longer you remain inside it. In 1915, far from any ocean route, far from any human settlement, a ship named Endurance became trapped in ice, not drifting, not moving, but held in place, frozen. The expedition, led by Ernest Shackleton, had intended to cross Antarctica. Instead, they became part of it. At first, the men still followed routine. They woke up at the same time. They performed tasks. They spoke to one another in ordinary voices. Structure remained, and as long as structure exists, the mind has something to hold on to. But days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months, and the ship never moved. The ice closed in slowly, almost gently. No sudden crash, no dramatic collapse, just pressure building over time, a quiet force tightening until one day the wood began to bend, then crack, then give way. The Endurance was not destroyed in a single moment. It was slowly undone. And when it finally sank beneath the ice, it left the men behind in a world that had no edges, only white, endless white. Above them, the sky, pale, distant. Below them, the ice, solid, unmoving. Around them, nothing. No landmarks, no direction, no sound, but the occasional groan of shifting ice and the wind. It is difficult to imagine what happens to the human mind in such a place because the brain is designed for contrast, light and dark, near and far, movement and stillness. But here, everything becomes the same. And when everything looks the same, the mind begins to lose its grip on what is real. At first, it begins with small things, a feeling that someone is walking behind you. You turn, no one is there. You tell yourself, it's nothing, just the wind, just your imagination. You continue walking, but the feeling returns, not stronger, just persistent, like a thought that refuses to fade. Some of the men began to speak about it quietly, not openly, not as a complaint, but as a question. Did you feel that? Did you hear something? At first, the answers were uncertain, but over time, a pattern began to form. They were not alone, not physically. There were still men around them, but something else seemed to be there, an extra presence, a step that did not belong to anyone, a shadow that moved without a source, a sense, deep, unmistakable, that someone or something was walking beside them. They could not see it, they could not describe it, but they could feel it. And the strangest part was that it did not feel threatening. It did not feel like fear. It felt supportive, as if this unseen companion was helping them continue. Later, this phenomenon would be known as the third man factor. It has been reported by explorers, mountaineers, survivors of shipwrecks, people pushed to the very edge of endurance. But in that moment, in 1915, it was not a theory. It was simply happening. Imagine walking across an endless field of ice, each step slow, deliberate, your body tired, your thoughts heavy. The horizon never changes. The sky never shifts. There is no destination you can see, only a direction you must trust. And beside you, just at the edge of awareness, someone is there, keeping pace, not speaking, not touching, but present. And somehow that presence makes the next step possible. Some men later said they felt guided, as if the companion knew where to go. Others said it was like having someone share the burden, not physically, but mentally, a division of weight. And in extreme conditions, even a small reduction in mental strain can mean survival. Why does the mind do this? Why would it create something that is not there? Because the human brain is not built for isolation. It is built for connection. Even when there is no one else, it will create someone, not as a flaw, but as a response, a way to maintain balance when everything else has been stripped away. The men of the Endurance did not speak of it loudly. They did not write detailed explanations at the time, because to explain it would be to question it, and questioning it might make it disappear. And they were not ready to lose it, because in that vast, empty silence, it was the only thing that felt close, the only thing that felt human. Eventually, Shackleton would lead his men across ice, then open ocean, in one of the most remarkable survival journeys in history. They would return, they would speak, and only then would the stories surface. Stories of footsteps that were not theirs, of a presence that stayed just out of sight, of a companion who existed only when needed most, and then was gone. Not dramatically, not suddenly, just absent, like a dream that fades the moment you try to hold on to it. The ocean and the ice do not just test the body, they reshape the mind. They remove everything familiar until the brain is left alone with itself. And in that solitude, it does something extraordinary. It creates not illusions meant to deceive, but experiences meant to sustain. Because when there is nothing left, no land, no sound, no certainty, the mind becomes the last place where you are not alone. And sometimes that is enough to keep walking. The ship that was still there, 1872. There are moments at sea when absence feels heavier than presence, not because something is there, but because something should be there and isn't. And in that quiet gap, the mind begins to ask questions it cannot answer. In December of 1872, a merchant vessel named Mary Celeste was found drifting in the Atlantic Ocean. She was not damaged. Her sails were partially set, her hull intact, her cargo undisturbed. There were no signs of struggle, no broken wood, no blood, nothing that would suggest violence. And yet, there was no one on board, not a single soul. The ship had departed from New York weeks earlier, carrying a captain, his family, and a crew of experienced sailors. They had everything they needed: food, water, navigation instruments. And then they were simply gone. When another ship, the Dei Gratia, came across the Mary Celeste, they did not approach immediately. From a distance, everything looked normal, too normal. The ship moved gently with the waves as if guided by an invisible hand. Her course was uncertain, but not chaotic. She did not drift like a wreck. She sailed slowly, quietly, as if still commanded. That was the first unsettling detail, because a ship without a crew should not behave like one that still has one. When the boarding party finally stepped onto the deck, they expected something: disorder, panic, the anic, evidence of departure. But instead, they found stillness, a deep, unmoving stillness, the kind that does not feel empty, but paused, as if time itself had stopped just moments before they arrived. The captain's belongings were still in place, clothing neatly arranged, personal items untouched. In the galley, there were signs that a meal had been prepared not long ago. Utensils set, food partially used. It was not decay they found, it was interruption, a life, mid-motion, suddenly cut off. And that is what made it difficult to understand, because when something ends, we expect a reason, a storm, a fire, a visible cause. But here, there was none. The lifeboat was missing. That much was clear. But why would an entire crew abandon a ship that was still seaworthy? Why leave behind food, water, shelter for a small, uncertain boat in the open ocean? The logbook offered little. Entries stopped abruptly. No explanation, no warning, just silence. And in that silence, the imagination begins to move. At first, the sailors who discovered the ship tried to remain practical. They checked every room, every corner, every detail. They looked for clues, for patterns, for anything that would bring the story back into the realm of logic. But the more they searched, the less they found. And the less they found, the more their thoughts began to shift. Because when reality provides no narrative, the mind creates one. Standing on the deck of a ship that should be alive, but is not, thought changes something inside you. The wind still moves the sails. The wood still creaks beneath your feet. The ocean continues its endless rhythm. Everything behaves as if life is present, except it isn't. And that contradiction is where imagination begins to take root. Some later said they felt watched, not in a clear, defined way, but subtly, as if someone had just stepped out of sight, as if footsteps had stopped just before they turned their head. Others described a sensation that the ship was not entirely empty, not physically occupied, but not abandoned either. A presence that lingered, not visible, not audible, but felt, and in a place where the line between reality and perception is already thin. That feeling becomes difficult to dismiss. The Mary Celeste did not just present a mystery, she created a space where imagination could exist freely, because there were no answers to anchor it, no clear ending to the story, only fragments, a meal that was never finished, a journey that was never completed, a crew that was never found. Over time, theories emerged: piracy, mutiny, natural disaster. Some suggested alcohol fumes from the cargo caused panic. Others imagined a sudden threat, something unseen that drove the crew to flee. And then there were the stories that went further, stories of strange lights, of sea creatures, of forces that could not be explained, not because there was evidence for them, but because there was space for them. And the human mind does not like empty space. It fills it, not always with truth, but with meaning. And sometimes meaning feels more important than accuracy. Even today, the Mary Celeste remains unsolved. There are reasonable explanations, probable scenarios, but none that fully close the gap, none that erase the image of a ship moving across the ocean without a single person on board. And perhaps that is why it stays with us, not because it is the most dramatic story at sea, but because it leaves something unfinished, something open, something that the mind continues to return to again and again, because deep down we understand something about that ship. We understand what it means to encounter a silence that is too complete, to stand in a place where everything should make sense but doesn't, and in that moment to feel the quiet pull of imagination, not as a choice but as a necessity, because when reality stops speaking, the mind will always find a way to answer. The horizon that never changes. There is a moment that almost every sailor experiences, though few describe it the same way. It does not come during a storm, not in danger, not in chaos. It comes in stillness, when the sea is calm, when the wind softens, when the ship moves so gently, you almost forget that it is moving at all. And in that quiet, you look out toward the horizon. At first, it is just a line, a simple division between water and sky. But the longer you look, the more something begins to change, not in the world, but in you, because the horizon never comes closer. No matter how long you travel, no matter how far you go, it remains at the same distance, always there, always out of reach. And that is something the human mind is not designed to accept. On land, every direction leads somewhere. A road bends, a mountain rises, a building marks the end of a path. But at sea, there is no end, only continuation. And when the mind cannot find an endpoint, It begins to search for meaning instead. In the 15th century, long before maps were complete, sailors crossed oceans without knowing what waited beyond the edge of their charts. Men aboard the ships of Christopher Columbus sailed west into waters that had no defined boundary. There were no guarantees, no confirmation that land existed beyond the horizon, only belief and fear, because when you stare at a horizon that never changes, it begins to feel like a boundary, not a distance, but a limit. Some sailors believed they were approaching the edge of the world, not metaphorically, literally, a place where the sea would fall away into nothing. Others spoke of creatures beneath the surface, massive shapes moving just below sight, not because they saw them clearly, but because the mind begins to imagine what cannot be seen, and the ocean is mostly unseen. On long voyages, patterns begin to form, not real patterns, but perceived ones. Clouds become structures, waves resemble movement, reflections distort into shapes. A glimmer of light becomes a distant fire, a ripple in the water becomes something alive, and sometimes what is imagined feels more convincing than what is real. Columbus himself recorded something unusual. On the night before land was finally sighted in 1492, he reported seeing a faint light in the distance. It moved, it flickered, it appeared, then disappeared. He described it as if it were a candle rising and falling in the darkness. No one could confirm it. No one could explain it. But in that moment, after weeks of endless ocean, that light meant something. Not because it was proven, but because it was needed. The next day, land was found, and so the light became part of the story, not as evidence, but as a symbol of how the mind reaches forward even before reality arrives. Because when the horizon never changes, the brain begins to project. It imagines what should be there, what could be there, what must be there for the journey to make sense. And this does not only happen in history. Even now, modern sailors describe something similar. Long periods at sea with no visual variation create a kind of mental echo. Thoughts repeat, time stretches, moments lose definition. You begin to feel as if you are not moving, even when you are. And in that stillness, your perception shifts. The horizon feels closer, then farther. The sky feels lower. The sea feels deeper. Everything becomes slightly altered. Not enough to notice immediately, but enough to change how you experience it. Some describe seeing shapes that vanish when focused on. Others hear distant sounds that cannot be traced. Not loud, not clear, just enough to be noticed and then questioned. Because when your environment does not change, your mind begins to. It becomes more sensitive, more active, more willing to interpret. And interpretation is where imagination lives. The horizon does not create illusions. It creates space, a vast, uninterrupted space where the brain is left alone with its own patterns, its own memories, its own expectations. And in that space, it builds, not randomly, but purposefully, to maintain balance, to preserve meaning, to prevent the silence from becoming too complete. Because complete silence is something the human mind resists. It fills it with thought, with memory, with imagined presence, just as those on the raft imagined land, and those in the ice felt a companion. Those who stare at the horizon long enough begin to see more than what is there. not because they are mistaken, but because they are human. And the human mind does not simply observe the world. It participates in it. It shapes it, especially when the world offers so little in return. So the horizon remains unchanged, unmoving, endless, and somewhere between the water and the sky, between what is seen and what is felt, the imagination quietly unfolds, not as a weakness, but as a response to distance, to silence, to the infinite. And if you stay there long enough, you may begin to understand something simple and strangely comforting, that even in the most empty places on Earth, the mind never leaves you alone. The night the ocean began to whisper, 1945. There are nights at sea when the darkness feels heavier than usual, not because the sky is darker, but because something inside you has begun to change. In July of 1945, near the end of World War II, a heavy cruiser named USS Indianapolis was moving quietly across the Pacific Ocean. Its mission had been completed. It had delivered a classified cargo, components that would later be used in the atomic bomb. Now, it was returning. No escort, no protection, just a single ship moving through a vast, indifferent ocean. Shortly after midnight, on July 30th, everything changed. A torpedo struck, then another, fired from a Japanese submarine commanded by Mokitsura Hashimoto. The impact was sudden, violent. There was no time to process, no time to prepare. Within minutes, the USS Indianapolis began to sink. Men were thrown into the water, some injured, some disoriented, some already gone. And then silence. The ship disappeared beneath the surface, leaving hundreds of men behind, floating, scattered, alone, but not entirely. At first, they believed rescue would come quickly. It had to. This was a military vessel. Its route was known. Surely someone would notice. Surely someone would come. But the ocean does not move according to human expectation. Hours passed, then a full day, then another. No ships appeared, no planes, nothing, only water stretching in every direction. During the day, the sun burned, relentless, unforgiving, skin blistered, eyes strained, and thirst grew stronger. But it was the night that changed everything. Because at night, the ocean becomes something else. The surface disappears into darkness. The horizon vanishes. There is no longer a line between sky and sea, only black. And in that blackness, the mind begins to search. At first, the men stayed together. They formed small groups. They spoke. They reassured one another. Because as long as voices exist, reality feels stable. But as exhaustion set in, dehydration deepened, something began to shift. One man whispered that he saw a light far away, faint but steady. Others looked, and for a moment they saw it too. A flicker, rising and falling just above the waterline. Hope surged. Voices grew louder. That's a ship. That's rescue. Some began to swim toward it, slowly at first, then with urgency. Because when you are lost at sea, even the smallest sign becomes everything. But the light did not come closer. It did not respond. It simply remained distant and unreachable. And then it was gone. Just like that. Not fading, not dimming. Gone. The water returned to darkness. The sky remained silent, and those who had swum away were now farther from the group. alone, confused, drifting. That was the first moment when imagination overtook perception. But it would not be the last. As the days passed, dehydration intensified. The human brain depends on water. Without it, function begins to fail. Thoughts slow. Judgment weakens. Reality becomes unstable. Some of the men began to believe they were no longer in the ocean. They spoke of rivers, of lakes, of fresh water flowing just beneath them. One man insisted he could drink. He cupped his hands, scooped the seawater, and swallowed. At first, he smiled, relief, but it did not last. Salt water does not quench thirst, it accelerates it. And yet, his mind had already accepted a different truth. Others followed, because when your body is breaking and your mind offers an alternative, it becomes difficult to refuse. Groups began to fracture. Men argued, not over facts, but over realities. Some insisted rescue was coming from one direction. Others were certain it was another. Some claimed to hear engines, distant, rhythmic, just beyond hearing. They listened, they waited, but the sound never resolved into anything real. Still, they believed, because belief is easier than accepting silence. At night, the ocean moved beneath them, gently, almost calmly. But beneath the surface, shadows shifted, and sometimes those shadows became something more. Men spoke of shapes, large, moving, circling. Whether they truly saw them or imagined them became difficult to separate, because fear amplifies perception. Every movement in the water becomes significant. Every ripple becomes a signal, and when the mind is already unstable, it fills in the gaps. Some claimed they saw figures standing on the water. Others reached out as if someone was there to take their hand, calling names, speaking to people who were not present, reliving moments from their past as if they were happening again, not remembering, experiencing. And in those moments, the ocean disappeared, replaced by something else, something familiar, something safe, but only for a moment, because reality always returns. And when it does, it feels heavier, colder, more distant. Of the nearly 900 men who entered the water, only 316 survived. Not all were lost to the same cause. Some to injury, some to exposure, some to something less visible. The slow unraveling of the mind, because the ocean does not only take the body, it takes certainty. It removes structure. It erases boundaries until the only thing left is perception. And perception can change, especially in the dark, especially in silence, especially when the horizon disappears and the world becomes nothing but water and night. And in that place, the mind does what it must. It creates light when there is none. It creates sound when everything is quiet. It creates meaning when reality offers nothing. Not to deceive, but to survive, even if just for a little longer. The water that wasn't water. There is a point when thirst stops feeling like thirst. At first, it is simple. A dry throat, a tightening in the chest, a quiet awareness that something is missing. But over time, especially under the open sun, surrounded by nothing but salt water, it becomes something else, something deeper, something that begins to affect not just the body, but the way the world is seen. After the sinking of the USS Indianapolis, the men who remained in the water entered a different kind of struggle, not against waves, not against storms, but against their own perception, because water was everywhere, endless, unavoidable, and yet none of it could be used. The ocean offered the one thing they needed most in a form that would destroy them if they took it. That contradiction is difficult for the mind to hold, to be surrounded by water and still be dying of thirst. So the brain begins to adjust, not physically, but perceptually. At first, it begins with suggestion. Someone says, "I think this part is different." They dip their hand into the water, taste it, pause, then say, "It's not as salty." Others listen, because when you are desperate, even a small difference feels meaningful. A second person tries, then a third, and soon the idea begins to spread, not because it is true, but because it is possible, and possibility is enough. Under extreme dehydration, the brain begins to lose its ability to regulate reality. It no longer filters information correctly. Signals become distorted. Memories blend with perception. Desire becomes experience. And so, some of the men began to believe they had found fresh water, not all at once, not in a dramatic moment, but gradually, quietly. One man cups his hands, lifts the water to his lips, and drinks. He closes his eyes. For a moment, his body relaxes. His expression softens. Relief, real or imagined, it does not matter, because to him it is happening. Others watch. They hesitate because part of them knows. They have been told. They understand that salt water is dangerous. But another part, the part that is tired, that is burning, that is fading, wants to believe. And belief becomes stronger than knowledge. More begin to drink, small amounts at first, then more. Because once the mind accepts a new reality, it adjusts everything else to match. They begin to describe it. It tastes different here. It's not like before. It's safe. Words that would sound impossible in any other place. But here, they feel reasonable because reality has already begun to shift. Groups begin to divide, not by strength, not by rank, but by belief. Some refuse to drink. They hold on to what they know. They endure the thirst, even as it grows sharper. Others step away. They follow those who claim to have found something better, something different, something that makes sense in a world that no longer does. And as they drift apart, so do their realities. Those who remain begin to notice the change. The ones who drank become restless. Their speech becomes faster, less clear. They gesture toward things that are not there. They point to the distance, describing shapes, movement, places, not as imagination, but as fact. One man insists he sees a shoreline, not far, close enough to reach. He begins to move toward it, slowly at first, then with urgency, calling out to others to follow. But there is nothing there, only water, only the same horizon, unchanged. Yet to him, it is real, because the mind, once untethered from reality, does not easily return. Others speak of rivers, of cool water flowing beneath them. They describe dipping their hands into something fresh, something clean, something that does not burn their throat. They smile, they laugh. For brief moments, they are no longer in the ocean. They are somewhere else, somewhere easier. And those moments feel like salvation, even if they are not. Those who remain clear-minded watch this happen. They see the shift. They understand what is happening, but they cannot stop it because logic requires energy. Clarity requires strength. and both are fading. The sun continues to rise and set. Time passes, but not in a way that can be measured, only felt through the body, through the mind. And in that slow passage, the line between truth and illusion becomes thinner and thinner until it disappears. What makes this moment so quiet, so unsettling, is that it does not feel like madness. It feels natural, like the mind is simply adapting, doing what it must to survive a situation it was never meant to endure, because to fully accept reality would be unbearable. So it changes it just enough to continue, even if that continuation leads somewhere else, somewhere farther from truth, but closer to relief. And in the end, that is what the mind seeks. Not accuracy, not correctness, but relief. Even if it comes in the form of water that was never truly there. The shapes beneath the surface. There is a moment when fear no longer comes from what you see, but from what you cannot. In open water, the surface is only a boundary, a thin, shifting layer between the known and the unknown. Above it, light, air, sky. Below it, depth, unmeasured, unseen, endless. After the sinking of the USS Indianapolis, the men who remained in the ocean were no longer just facing thirst or exhaustion or time. They were facing something else, something quieter, something that did not announce itself. At first, it was only a feeling, a subtle awareness that the water beneath them was not empty, that something moved just beyond sight. No one could point to it directly. No one could describe it clearly, but they felt it. A shift in the water, a disturbance that did not match the rhythm of the waves. And once that feeling begins, it does not go away, because the human mind is not comfortable with uncertainty. It searches, it scans, it tries to define what cannot be seen. And in that process, it begins to imagine. One man says he saw something, a shadow, large, passing beneath him. Others listen. They turn slowly, trying not to move too much, trying not to disturb the surface, because movement might attract attention from something they cannot fully perceive. Another man insists he felt contact, not a strike, not an attack, just something brushing against his leg. Light, quick, gone before he could react, but enough to confirm that he was not alone. At first, these reports are met with hesitation, because acknowledging them makes them real. And reality in this moment is already difficult enough. But then the water begins to change, not visibly, not dramatically, but in small, unmistakable ways. Ripples that move against the current, circles forming, then disappearing, and occasionally a sudden movement, a break in the surface, a splash that does not match the motion of a human body. And that is when the imagination begins to merge with instinct, because deep down, the human brain carries something ancient, a recognition, a memory, older than language, that the ocean is not empty, that it contains life that does not belong to us, that we are not the only presence in the water. As the days pass, the men begin to cluster more tightly, groups forming instinctively, not out of strategy, but out of instinct, because being alone feels more dangerous, even if the danger cannot be seen. Some begin to speak of shapes, not clearly defined, not detailed, but present, something moving below, keeping pace, circling. Others refuse to look down. They keep their eyes on the horizon because what you do not see is easier to ignore. But the mind does not always allow that. It fills in what is missing. It completes the image even when the eyes cannot. A shadow becomes a form. A ripple becomes movement, and movement becomes intent. This is where imagination and reality begin to overlap. Because there were sharks, that is known, that is recorded. But what each man experienced was not only the presence of shark, it was the amplification of that presence through a mind already strained, already searching, already unstable. Every touch felt larger, every shadow deeper, every moment longer, and time begins to stretch. A few seconds feel like minutes. A glance downward feels like a decision to see or not to see. Some men began to react to things that were not there. Sudden movements, sharp turns, pushing water away, as if something had come too close. Others froze completely, holding still, as if stillness could make them invisible. And in a way, it did. Not physically, but mentally, because when you stop moving, you reduce the number of variables. You simplify the world. Water, sky, breath, nothing else. And sometimes that simplicity is the only way to hold on to control. But control is fragile, especially in an environment when nothing belongs to you. The ocean does not recognize boundaries. It does not separate imagination from reality. It does not distinguish between what is seen and what is felt. It simply exists, and within it, the mind must navigate both the real danger below and the imagined danger layered on top of it. Because even when nothing is there, the mind can still create something, a shape, a presence, a movement. And once created, it carries weight. It influences behavior. It changes decisions. It becomes part of the experience. And that is what makes this moment so quiet and so powerful. Because it is not just about what was in the water. It is about how the mind responds to not knowing, to being surrounded by something vast and unseen, to feeling that you are being observed from below, even when you cannot prove it, even when you cannot confirm it. Because in the ocean, certainty is rare, and in its absence, the imagination does not stay still. It moves, it expands, it watches the water and begins to see more than what is there. And sometimes that is enough to change everything. When rescue becomes a vision, there is a point when hope begins to change its shape. At first, hope is simple. It is clear, defined. A ship will come, a plane will pass overhead, someone will notice. Rescue is an event, something that arrives from the outside. But when time stretches, when hours turn into days, and nothing appears, hope does not disappear. It transforms. After days in the water, following the sinking of the USS Indianapolis, the men who remained were no longer waiting for rescue in the same way, because waiting requires certainty, and certainty had already faded. The sun rose again and again, each time bringing the same light, the same heat, the same unchanging horizon. No ships, no aircraft, no sign that anything beyond the ocean still existed. And that is when hope begins to turn inward. Instead of looking outward, the mind begins to create what it needs. At first, it is subtle, a distant sound, faint, almost imagined, a low hum, rhythmic, familiar. Some men lift their heads. They listen carefully, trying to separate it from the wind, from the movement of the water, from their own breathing. It's an engine, someone whispers. Others hear it too, or believe they do, because the brain, when deprived of input, becomes more sensitive. It amplifies signals. Even when those signals are incomplete, the sound grows clearer, more defined. Some begin to point toward the sky. There, they say. Do you see it? A shape moving slowly across the light. For a moment, it feels real. A plane, rescue. Voices rise, hands lift, energy returns just for a moment, because hope can generate strength even in a body that has none left. Some begin to wave, some try to stand, though there is nothing to stand on. They call out, louder, stronger, as if sound alone could bring the vision closer. But the shape does not change. It does not respond. And slowly it fades, not dramatically, not suddenly, just dissolving into the brightness, leaving nothing behind except silence and the quiet realization that it was never there. This happens again, not once, not twice, but many times. A ship on the horizon, a silhouette against the light, a line that looks almost straight enough to be real. Each time, the same pattern, recognition, belief, action, and then absence, because the mind does not stop trying. It continues to project, to create, to offer possibilities, even when reality does not confirm them. Some men begin to speak as if rescue has already come. They describe what will happen. They'll pull us up. They'll give us water. We'll be home soon. Not as a future, but as something already in motion, something certain. And for a moment, their voices carry a kind of calm, a peace that does not match their condition, because in their minds, the outcome has already been decided. Others begin to withdraw. They close their eyes, not to sleep, but to see something else, something different. They speak to people who are not present, family, friends, voices from another place. They smile, they respond, as if the ocean has been replaced by something familiar, something safe. These are not memories, not in the usual sense. They are experiences happening now, because the brain, when pushed beyond its limits, does not simply recall, it recreates. And in those moments, the need for rescue disappears, because the mind has already left the ocean. It has gone somewhere else, somewhere where thirst does not exist, where the sun does not burn, where the horizon has meaning again. Those who remain aware watch this happen. They understand, or at least they sense, that something is changing, that the struggle is no longer only physical, it is perceptual. And once perception shifts, reality follows, not externally, but internally. And that is where survival becomes uncertain, because when the mind begins to accept what is not real, it becomes harder to respond to what is. Signals are missed, opportunities are not recognized, energy is spent on things that do not exist. And yet, it is not a failure, it is not weakness, it is adaptation, a final attempt to reduce suffering, to create comfort in a place that offers none. And then, on the fifth day, something changes. Not in the mind, but in the world. A plane appears, real, visible, confirmed. At first, it looks no different from the others. A shape in the sky, a movement against the light. And so, some do not react because they have seen this before. because they have believed before, because they have been wrong too many times. But this time, it does not disappear. It grows larger, closer. The sound becomes clear, distinct, unmistakable. Engines, real engines. The plane circles. It lowers. It signals. And slowly, the difference becomes undeniable. This is not imagination. This is not projection. This is not the mind trying to help. This is rescue. Of the nearly 900 men who entered the water, only 316 would be saved. Not all who saw the plane could respond. Not all who heard it could believe it, because by the time rescue arrives, the mind has already traveled far, somewhere beyond the ocean, somewhere beyond the horizon. Bringing it back is not always possible. But for those who remain, who held on to something, even when reality became uncertain, the plane was not just rescue. It was confirmation that not everything the mind creates is an illusion, that sometimes, after days of silence, after visions that fade, after hope reshapes itself, again and again, something real does arrive, quietly, slowly, but unmistakably. And in that moment, the ocean releases its hold, not completely, but enough for the mind to return. The light before land, 14092. There are journeys where the distance is not measured in miles, but in uncertainty, where each day does not bring you closer to something known, but deeper into something undefined. In the late summer of 1492, 3 ships crossed the Atlantic Ocean: the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. They sailed under the command of Christopher Columbus, moving westward into waters that, for many of the men on board, felt like the edge of the world itself. At that time, maps were incomplete. The ocean ahead was not clearly understood. There were no reliable charts, no confirmed destinations, only theory and belief. And as the days passed, that belief began to thin. At first, the voyage followed a rhythm: waves, wind, sails adjusting to invisible currents. The men worked, they slept, they spoke of what might be waiting ahead. But as the horizon remained unchanged, as no land appeared, as nothing broke the endless repetition of sea and sky, something began to shift, because the human mind is not designed for endless sameness. It searches for change, for markers, for progress. And when those markers are absent, it begins to question. Some of the sailors grew restless, not loudly, not at first, but quietly, in the way they looked out toward the horizon, a little longer than before, in the way they spoke with less certainty, because every day that passed without land was a day that moved them farther from what they understood and deeper into what they did not. The ocean stretched endlessly. No mountains, no coastline, no birds at first, only water and sky, and the thin line between them that never changed. It is in this kind of environment that the mind begins to project, not as fantasy, but as necessity. Some men began to report signs, subtle things: a piece of floating wood, a patch of seaweed, a change in the movement of the waves. Each one became significant. Each one was interpreted as evidence, because the mind needs direction. It needs confirmation that the journey is leading somewhere, even when it cannot yet see where. Days turned into weeks. The tension grew, not from immediate danger, but from uncertainty, because uncertainty lingers. It does not strike suddenly. It builds quietly, steadily until it fills every thought. Some of the crew began to speak of turning back, not out of fear alone, but out of logic, because in their understanding, there should have been land by now, something visible, something real, but there was nothing. And when reality does not match expectation, the mind begins to search for alternatives. Stories began to circulate, old beliefs, ancient ideas of seas that stretched too far, of waters that led nowhere, of boundaries that should not be crossed, not because they were proven, but because they offered explanation. And explanation is something the mind clings to, especially when faced with the unknown. But Columbus remained focused, certain, or at least appearing certain, because leadership in moments like this is not only about direction, it is about holding a version of reality that others can follow, even when their own begins to fracture. And then, on the night of October 11th, something happened. Columbus stood on deck, looking out across the dark water. The sky was clear, the sea calm, the horizon invisible in the night. And then he saw a light, faint, small, but distinct. It moved, not steadily, but irregularly, rising, then falling, appearing, then disappearing, like a candle held by someone walking far in the distance. He watched it carefully, trying to understand, trying to confirm, because at sea, especially after long periods without change, the mind can create things, shapes in the dark, movements in the corner of the eye, things that feel real but are not. And so he called others to look. Some saw it, others did not. It flickered again, then vanished, then returned, never staying long enough to be fully certain, but present enough to be remembered. Was it land? Was it human? Was it real? No one could say with confidence. And yet, in that moment, after weeks of nothing, that light became something more than just a visual. It became meaning. It became possibility, because the mind, after enduring so much emptiness, is ready to believe, ready to accept even the smallest signal as confirmation. Hours passed. The light did not return again in the same way. The night continued, quiet, unbroken, and yet something had shifted, because once the mind sees something, even briefly, it does not return to its previous state. It begins to anticipate, to expect, to prepare. And so, when morning came and land was finally sighted, the light from the night before took on a new meaning. It became the first sign, the earliest signal, a moment where imagination and reality touched, even if only briefly, even if never fully explained, because that is what the ocean does. It stretches the mind until the line between what is seen and what is believed becomes thin. And in that thin space, something appears, a light, a shape, a possibility, not always real, not always false, but always important, because sometimes before reality arrives, the mind must first learn how to see it. The creatures that lived in the mind. Long before the ocean was mapped, before its currents were understood, before its depths were measured, it was imagined not as water, but as something alive, something vast, unpredictable, and filled with things that could not be seen, but were deeply believed. For centuries, sailors did not cross the sea with certainty. They crossed it with stories, stories of creatures that lived beneath the surface, far below the reach of light, waiting not always to attack, but to exist because the ocean, to them, was not empty space. It was a world layered with presence. On medieval maps, especially those drawn in Europe between the 14th and 16th centuries, the edges of the known world were not left blank. They were filled with forms, with shapes, with beings that had no confirmed existence, but felt necessary. These maps were called Mappa Mundi, and on them the sea was alive with creatures, serpents with bodies longer than ships, fish with faces like men, beasts with open mouths, waiting at the edges of the known world. These were not decorations, they were interpretations, because when a place cannot be seen, the mind will define it anyway. And in the case of the ocean, it defined it with life. One of the most enduring of these imagined beings was the sea serpent, a long, coiling form, sometimes described as smooth, sometimes covered in scales, always immense. Sailors spoke of seeing it rise from the water, not fully, never fully, just a portion, a curve, a movement, a shape breaking the surface before disappearing again. And in that brief moment, a complete image was formed, not from what was seen, but from what was expected, because expectation is one of the strongest forces in perception. Another creature, even more powerful in the imagination, was the Kraken, said to dwell in the cold waters of the North Atlantic. The Kraken was not simply a creature, it was a force large enough to pull entire ships beneath the surface. Its presence was described not by its appearance, but by its effect. Sudden waves, unnatural currents, a darkness rising from below. Sailors claimed that when the Kraken moved, the ocean itself changed. And so every unexplained movement in the water, every shift in the surface became something more. Because once a story exists, it begins to shape reality. A shadow becomes a tentacle, a wave becomes a sign, and over time, those interpretations solidify, not into truth, but into belief. Even highly experienced sailors, men who had crossed the ocean many times, reported seeing things they could not explain, not clearly, not with certainty, but consistently. A shape beneath the water, moving alongside the ship, too large to be a fish, too smooth to be a wave, something that seemed to follow, then disappear. They would describe it later, not as imagination, but as observation, because in the moment it felt real, and that feeling is difficult to dismiss. Part of this comes from the nature of the ocean itself. It hides most of what it contains. Light fades quickly beneath the surface. Details disappear. Distance becomes distorted. A small object can appear large. A distant movement can feel close. And in that distortion, the mind fills in what is missing, not randomly, but based on what it already knows. Stories, images, expectations. And so, if a sailor has heard of serpents, he is more likely to see one. If he believes in creatures below, he will interpret shadows differently. This is not weakness. It is pattern recognition, working under conditions where patterns are incomplete. There are also moments when multiple people report the same thing, not because it is confirmed, but because it is shared. One man sees something. He describes it. Others look. And in looking, they begin to see it too. Not exactly the same, but close enough, because the mind can align itself with others, especially in uncertain environments, especially at sea. And once a shared image is formed, it becomes stronger, more stable, more real. Over time, science would offer explanations. Large squids, capable of reaching immense sizes, moving silently beneath the surface. Whales, their backs breaking the water in ways that resemble something else. Optical illusions created by light, reflection, and distance. But these explanations came later, after the stories had already spread, after the images had already taken root. And even now, those stories remain, not because they are proven, but because they resonate, because they reflect something deeper. The human response to the unknown, the need to give form to what cannot be seen, to turn uncertainty into something recognizable, something that can be described, even if it is not fully understood. Because at sea, especially in its vast, silent spaces, the mind does not stay still. It reaches downward into the darkness, and from that darkness, it brings something back, a shape, a creature, a presence, not always real, but never meaningless. Because sometimes what we imagine is simply our way of standing in front of something too large to fully comprehend and giving it a form we can face. The land that moves away. There is a particular kind of illusion that only appears when you need it most, not in comfort, not in safety, but in distance, in exhaustion, in the quiet moment when the mind begins to search for something that is not yet there. At sea, this illusion often takes one form above all others: land, not memory of land, not hope of land, but the sight of it, clear, defined, almost within reach, and yet never real. Sailors have described it for centuries: a coastline appearing on the horizon, dark against the light, with shapes that resemble cliffs or trees or structures. Sometimes it stays for minutes, sometimes longer, long enough to study, long enough to believe. And that is what makes it dangerous, because it does not feel like imagination. It feels like discovery. In the 16th and 17th centuries, long voyages across the Atlantic and Pacific became more common. Ships traveled for weeks, sometimes months, without sight of land. And during those journeys, reports began to accumulate, not of storm, not of battles, but of sightings. Islands that appeared, then disappeared. Coastlines that could not be reached, no matter how long the ship sailed toward them. One of the most well-known examples is the phenomenon later associated with the Fata Morgana, a type of mirage that occurs when layers of air at different temperatures bend light in unusual ways. Objects beyond the horizon are lifted, stretched, distorted. What should be hidden becomes visible, but not accurately, not clearly. Instead, it becomes something else. A mountain becomes a tower, a ship becomes a city, a distant cloud becomes land. And to those watching, it is convincing, because the mind does not expect deception from light. It trusts what it sees, especially when what it sees matches what it hopes. Imagine standing on the deck of a ship after weeks at sea, your body tired, your thoughts repeating, your sense of direction fading, and then on the horizon, something appears. A line, not flat, uneven, broken in places. You look closer. It holds. It does not move like a wave. It does not dissolve like a cloud. It remains. Others gather. They see it too. They begin to describe it. There on the left, that's looks like trees. Do you see the shape there? The image becomes clearer, not because it is changing, but because the mind is completing it, filling in gaps, adding detail, transforming suggestion into certainty. And in that moment, something shifts inside you. The journey changes because now it has an end point. Now there is something to move toward, something to reach. Energy returns, voices become stronger, movements more purposeful. Because belief restores direction, the ship adjusts its course, sails turn, men watch closely, measuring distance, tracking progress. But something feels wrong. The land does not grow larger. It does not come closer. It remains at the same distance, the same size, the same shape. Time passes, minutes, then hours, and slowly the realization begins. Not all at once, not clearly, but gradually. That what they are seeing is not moving because it was never there. The coastline begins to change. Edges soften, shapes dissolve, details fade, until finally it becomes what it always was. Light distorted, refracted, and then nothing. The horizon returns, flat, unbroken, silent, and the mind must adjust again, must release what it just held, must let go of something that felt real. This is what makes mirages so powerful. Not that they deceive the eye, but that they engage the mind. They offer something complete, a destination, a structure, a meaning, and then they remove it, leaving behind a deeper sense of distance, a sharper awareness of how far there is still to go. Over time, some of these illusions became stories. Maps were drawn, marking islands that did not exist. Names were given to places no one could return to, because once something is seen, even briefly, it becomes part of the record, part of memory. And memory does not always distinguish between what was real and what was believed. Even experienced navigators, men who understood the behavior of the sea, were not immune, because knowledge does not prevent perception, and perception is shaped by more than logic. It is shaped by need, by expectation, by the quiet pressure of time and distance and repetition. And so the ocean creates these moments where the mind reaches outward and finds something, only to discover that it must continue reaching, that the journey is not over, that the horizon still holds its distance. And in that space between what is seen and what is true, the imagination moves gently, quietly, building and releasing images of land that exist only long enough to remind us how much we want them to be real. The island that never was. There are places on the ocean that exist for a time. They are seen, named, written down, and then they are gone. Not destroyed, not submerged in any way that can be confirmed, just no longer there. For centuries, sailors recorded islands that could not be found again. They appeared on maps. They were given coordinates, sometimes even described in detail, their shape, their size, the color of their shoreline. And yet, when others returned to those same locations, there was nothing, only open water. One of the most enduring of these was an island known as High Brazil. It appeared on European maps for hundreds of years. West of Ireland, a circular landmass, often drawn with a river or division through its center. Sailors claim to have seen it, not always clearly, not always for long, but enough to describe, enough to believe. Some said it was visible only under certain conditions, when the air was clear, when the light struck the horizon in a particular way. Others believed it appeared only once every few years, as if it existed somewhere between presence and absence, a place that could not be reached, only glimpsed. Ships set out to find it. Navigators marked its position carefully. They sailed to the exact coordinates, measured distance, tracked direction. But when they arrived, there was nothing, no land, no structure, no sign that anything had ever been there. And yet, the island remained on map, because once something is recorded, it does not disappear easily, even when reality cannot confirm it. There were others. Isle of Demons, said to be haunted, marked by strange sounds and unseen presences. Sandy Island, charted in the Pacific Ocean, appearing on maps for over a century before being officially removed when modern expeditions found only deep water. Each of these places shared something in common. They were seen, believed, and then lost, not gradually, but completely. And what remains is not the island itself, but the question, how can something be seen by multiple people, recorded, mapped, and yet not exist? Part of the answer lies in the nature of the ocean. It reflects, it distorts, it bends light in ways that are not always intuitive. A distant landmass can appear closer than it is. A cloud formation can resemble terrain. A mirage can hold its shape long enough to be mistaken for something solid. But that is only part of it, because what transforms a momentary illusion into a lasting belief is the mind. The moment someone says, "I see land," the possibility is introduced. Others look, they search, and in searching, they begin to see it too. Not exactly the same, but close enough to confirm. And once confirmed, it becomes shared, a collective perception, and collective perception is powerful. It stabilizes the image. It gives it weight. It moves it from imagination into something that feels like reality. And then it is written down, drawn, named, placed onto a map. And once something is on a map, it becomes part of the world, even if the world cannot find it again. There is also something quieter at work, something deeper, the human need to believe that something exists beyond the horizon, not just water, not just distance, but a destination, a place, a point where the journey ends. Phantom Islands offer that, even if only briefly, even if only in appearance. They provide shape to an otherwise shapeless expanse, meaning to an otherwise endless direction. And when they disappear, they leave something behind, not emptiness, but memory, a record of having seen something that felt real, even if it wasn't, even if it cannot be proven, even if it cannot be returned to. And in that way, they continue to exist, not in the ocean, but in the mind, because the mind does not require permanence to create significance. It only requires experience, a moment, a sight, a feeling that something was there. And perhaps that is enough, because the ocean has always been a place where reality is not always fixed, where distance bends perception, where light reshapes form, where time stretches experience. And in that shifting space, the line between what is seen and what is believed remains just slightly uncertain, like an island on the edge of the horizon that appears only long enough to remind us how easily the mind can give shape to the unknown. The Raft of Hope, 1942. There are moments at sea when hope does not disappear. It simply becomes quieter, less certain, less visible, but still there, beneath everything. In November of 1942, in the cold waters of the South Atlantic, a British passenger ship named RMS Laconia was struck by a torpedo. It was night. The ocean was dark, calm on the surface, silent in a way that gives no warning. The ship carried soldiers, civilians, prisoners of war, lives layered together, moving across the same water toward different destinations. And then, in a matter of minutes, all of that structure collapsed. The explosion was sudden, disorienting. Metal twisted, water rushed in, voices rose, then were swallowed by confusion. Lifeboats were launched, not in perfect order, not with clear instruction, just movement, urgent, uncoordinated. People climbed down ropes, stepped into small wooden boats, or slipped directly into the sea. And then distance began. The ship remained visible for a time, large, familiar, a reference point. But as it sank, slowly, inevitably, that reference disappeared, and with it, something else. Certainty. The lifeboats drifted, not in a single direction, but outward, carried by currents, by wind, by the quiet motion of the ocean. Each boat became its own world, a small circle of people surrounded by something too large to understand. At first, there was still communication. Voices carried across the water. Names were called. Questions asked. Are you there? Can you hear us? And for a while, there were answers. Faint, but present, enough to maintain connection. But as time passed, as distance grew, the voices faded one by one until each lifeboat was alone. And that is when hope begins to change. At first, it is directed outward, toward rescue, toward ships, toward something that will arrive. But as the hours pass and nothing appears, the mind begins to adjust, because it must. The ocean does not provide feedback. It does not confirm that help is coming. It does not respond to waiting. It simply continues. And in that continuation, the mind turns inward. In one lifeboat, a man points toward the horizon. There, he says quietly. Others follow his gaze. At first, there is nothing. Only the usual line where sea meets sky. But then a suggestion, a slight difference in color, a shape. That might be something. They look longer, more carefully, and slowly the image begins to form. Land, low, dark, almost blending into the distance, but present. And that is enough, because once the idea exists, the mind begins to build around it. It's an island. It has to be. They begin to describe it. Trees, a shoreline, maybe even movement. Not clearly, not precisely, but confidently, because confidence can exist before confirmation. And in that moment, something shifts. Energy returns. Posture changes, voices strengthen, because now there is direction, a place to go, something to move toward. The boat turns, slowly, not with certainty, but with intention. Oars dip into the water, movements become coordinated, because belief creates structure, and structure restores purpose. Time passes, the island remains. It does not grow larger, it does not become clearer, but it does not disappear either. And so it continues to guide them, hour after hour, stroke after stroke, until exhaustion returns, until the body reminds them of its limits. And then doubt begins, not suddenly, but quietly. A hesitation, a second look, a longer pause, because something is not changing. Something is not behaving as it should. The shape remains distant, unmoved, and slowly the realization forms that what they are seeing is not approaching because it is not there. The island fades, not dramatically, not in a single moment, but gradually. Edges soften, color dissolves, form disappears until only the horizon remains, flat, unbroken, silent, and with it comes a different kind of stillness. Not the stillness of waiting, but the stillness of understanding. That hope can take shape even when there is nothing to hold it. But the mind does not stop. It cannot, because to stop would be to accept the full weight of the ocean. And so it continues to create, not illusions meant to deceive, but visions meant to sustain. Another lifeboat reports something similar. A ship in the distance, a mast, a line against the sky. They call out, wave, try to signal, and for a moment it feels real because the need is real. But the ship does not respond. It does not move closer. It does not change. And eventually it disappears, like the island, like the light, like all the things that exist just long enough to be believed. And yet these visions are not meaningless. They serve a purpose. They create motion when there would otherwise be none. They generate energy when the body is failing. They provide direction in a place without landmarks. And sometimes that is enough, because survival at sea is not only about strength or endurance. It is about perception, about what the mind chooses to see when reality offers nothing. And in that small lifeboat, surrounded by water beneath a sky that does not answer, hope remains, not as certainty, not as guarantee, but as something quieter, something internal, something that appears even when there is no land, something that guides even when there is no direction. And in that way, the mind becomes its own horizon, always distant, always shifting, but always just enough to keep moving. The voices that call you home. There is a moment when the ocean becomes quiet in a different way, not because the waves have calmed or the wind has stopped, but because something inside you has begun to turn inward after long hours, then days, adrift in lifeboats, following the sinking of the RMS Laconia. The struggle was no longer only physical. Hunger could be endured. Thirst could be resisted. But silence was something else, because silence does not press from the outside. It expands from within. At first, the men spoke. They shared stories. They recalled where they had come from. They described the places they would return to. Homes, streets, voices, anything that felt anchored, because memory creates structure. It gives shape to time. It reminds the mind that there is a world beyond the ocean. But as exhaustion deepened, as energy faded, the conversations became shorter, less frequent. Words require effort, and effort was becoming scarce. And so the mind began to continue those conversations on its own. At first, it feels like remembering a familiar voice, repeating something once heard, a phrase, a tone, A name spoken in a certain way. You recognize it. You know where it comes from. And so you accept it. But then something shifts. The voice responds, not as memory, but as presence, as if the person is there, just outside your field of vision, close enough to hear, but not to see. And that is when the line begins to blur. One man turns his head slightly, as if someone has called him. He listens, pauses, then answers, quietly, as if careful not to disturb something fragile. Others notice, though they do not interrupt, because they understand, or at least they feel something similar. A name spoken in a voice that is not their own, a sentence that seems to arrive from somewhere else, not imagined, but heard. And in that moment, it feels real, not convincing, not questionable, simply real. The brain, under extreme conditions, begins to reorganize its signals. External input is reduced. There is less to see, less to hear, less to process. And so internal signals become stronger, more vivid, more present. Memory becomes experience. Thought becomes sound, and sound becomes voice. Some begin to speak to people who are not there. A wife, a mother, a child. They describe things. They ask questions. They wait for answers. And sometimes they receive them, not in words that can be confirmed, but in responses that feel complete, that feel sufficient, as if a conversation is happening just beyond the edge of reality. Others begin to hear instructions, gentle, reassuring. Stay still, keep going. You're almost there. Not commands, not urgent, but calm, supportive. And because they come from a familiar tone, they are trusted, even if they cannot be explained. These voices do not create panic. They do not confuse. They soothe, they stabilize, because the mind, when isolated, seeks connection. And if connection is not available, it will create it, not as illusion, but as function, as a way to maintain coherence, to prevent collapse. Because being alone, completely alone, is something the human brain resists deeply, instinctively, and so it generates presence, a voice, a response, a sense that someone is still there, listening, even if that someone exists only within. There are moments when these voices guide action. A man shifts position because he feels he should. Another holds on because he hears something telling him to. Not loudly, not forcefully, but persistently. And in those moments, the distinction between inner and outer no longer matters, because the effect is real. It keeps them present. It keeps them engaged. It keeps them from letting go. Of course, not all voices are gentle. Some are fragmented, unclear, repeating phrases without meaning, echoes of thoughts that have lost their structure. And those are harder to hold because they do not comfort. They confuse. They drift in and out without resolution. And in that fragmentation, the mind feels its own instability. But even then, it continues. It does not stop producing, because silence, true silence, would be worse. And so the voices remain, some clear, some broken, some familiar, some distant, all serving a purpose, even if that purpose is not fully understood. Because in that lifeboat, surrounded by water, beneath a sky that offers no response, the mind is doing something extraordinary. It is maintaining connection in the absence of others. It is recreating presence in the face of isolation. It is building a bridge between what is and what is needed. And sometimes that bridge is enough not to escape the ocean, not to change reality, but to endure it, to remain for one more moment, one more hour, one more breath. And in that quiet space between thought and sound, between memory and voice, something remains, not visible, not tangible, but real in its effect, a presence that calls you not away from the ocean, but through it, back towards something familiar, something human, something that reminds you you are not completely alone. The time that slips away. There is something else the ocean takes that is harder to notice at first. Not your strength, not your direction, but your sense of time. At the beginning, time is still measured. You know when the sun rises. You notice when it begins to fall. You can feel the passing of hours through light, through shadow, through the rhythm of your own body. But after long exposure, after fatigue settles in, after hunger and thirst begin to blur everything, time starts to loosen, not all at once, not dramatically, just slightly. Minutes feel longer, then shorter. Moments stretch, then collapse. And slowly, the structure that holds time together begins to dissolve. In the lifeboats, drifting after the sinking of the RMS Laconia, this change came quietly. At first, someone would say, "It's been hours." Another would respond, "No, not that long." They would look at the sun, try to estimate, but the light was constant, the sky unchanging. There were no shadows to track, no clocks, no reference, only feeling. And feeling is not precise. One man believed they had only just left the ship, even after a full day had passed. Another was certain they had been drifting for several days, when it had only been one. Both were convinced. Both were wrong, because without markers, the mind cannot anchor time. It drifts, just like the body. Some began to count, not seconds, but breaths, movements, waves, trying to create rhythm, trying to impose structure, because structure is what allows time to exist. But even that begins to fail. Counting becomes inconsistent. Numbers are lost. Sequences break. And eventually, the effort itself fades, because maintaining time requires energy, and energy was disappearing. Days and nights begin to blend, the difference between them less distinct. The sun rises, but it feels like it never truly left. The sky darkens, but the darkness does not bring rest. Sleep becomes irregular, short, fragmented, moments of unconsciousness, followed by sudden awareness. And in those moments, it becomes unclear, did time pass or did it stop? Some wake up believing they have only closed their eyes for a second, when, in fact, hours have gone by. Others feel as though they have slept for a long time, when only minutes have passed. The mind loses its reference, and when that happens, it begins to create its own. Memory starts to shift. Events move closer together or farther apart. Something that happened yesterday feels like it was moments ago. Something that just occurred feels distant. And in that distortion, the present becomes unstable, harder to define, harder to hold. Because if you cannot locate yourself in time, it becomes difficult to locate yourself at all. Some men begin to speak of before and after without clear meaning. Before the sun, after the water. Phrases that suggest sequence but lack precision because precision is no longer available. Others stop referring to time altogether. They speak only in terms of feeling. I'm tired. I'm still here. Statements that do not require measurement, that do not depend on structure, because structure has already begun to disappear. This has a quiet effect, not immediately noticeable, but deeply influential. Without time, there is no progression, no sense of moving forward, no indication that anything is changing. And without change, the mind begins to stall. It no longer anticipates, no longer prepares. It simply exists moment to moment, breath to breath, not thinking of tomorrow, not remembering yesterday, only remaining. And in some ways, this is necessary because to think too far ahead would create fear. To think too far back would create longing, and both require energy. So the mind simplifies. It narrows its focus, reduces experience to what is immediately present. The feel of water, the sound of breath, the movement of the body, nothing more. And in that simplicity, time loses its meaning, not because it is gone, but because it is no longer needed. In the same way, there are moments when someone asks, "How long has it been?" and no one answers, not because they don't want to, but because they cannot. There is no shared reference, no agreed measure, only individual perception. And each perception is different. Some feel it has been endless. Others feel it has barely begun. Both are true in their own way, because time in that space is no longer objective. It becomes internal, fluid, shifting, and sometimes it disappears completely, leaving only the present, unmeasured, unstructured, undefined, and yet still moving. Because even when the mind loses track, time continues quietly, without confirmation, without awareness, until something external returns. A sound, a shape, a change, something that reintroduces sequence. That marks a moment. That creates a before and an after. And in that moment, time begins again. But until then, in the drifting silence of the ocean, beneath the sky that does not change, time becomes something else. Not a line, not a progression, but a space, wide, still, and slowly slipping away. The moment you stop searching, there is a moment so quiet that it almost goes unnoticed. It does not arrive with fear, not with pain, not even with exhaustion. It arrives when the mind stops reaching after days drifting in lifeboats, following the sinking of the RMS Laconia. Something subtle begins to change, not in the body, but in intention. At the beginning, everything is effort, looking toward the horizon, listening for sound, trying to identify shapes, signals, anything that might mean something. The mind is active, searching, projecting, hoping, even when nothing appears. It continues because searching creates the feeling of control, the sense that something can still be done. But as time passes, as thirst deepens, as energy fades, the effort becomes heavier, not impossible, just slower, more difficult to sustain. The eyes do not scan as often. The head does not turn as quickly. The moments between thought become longer, and then one day, without announcement, without decision, the searching stops. Not completely, but enough to notice. If you are paying attention, a man who once watched the horizon constantly now looks at it only occasionally. Another, who used to respond to every sound, now lets it pass, not because they do not care, not because they have given up, but because something inside them has shifted. The need to find something has been replaced by the need to remain. And those are not the same. Searching looks outward. Remaining turns inward. It reduces movement, simplifies thought, narrows attention, because the mind begins to understand something difficult, that not every effort changes the outcome, and so it begins to conserve not just energy, but perception. It stops chasing every possibility, stops reacting to every suggestion, stops building new images on the horizon, because each image requires investment, belief, hope, and when those images dissolve, they take something with them. So the mind becomes quieter, more selective, more still. A shape appears in the distance. No one speaks, not immediately. They look, but without urgency, without the same intensity as before, because they have seen this too many times. A sound rises in the air, faint, unclear. No one calls it out. No one reaches. They listen, but gently, without expectation, because expectation has become heavy, and letting it go has made something easier. This is not surrender. It is not defeat. It is adjustment, a movement toward balance, because constant searching cannot be sustained indefinitely. And when the body weakens, the mind adapts. It removes what is not essential, and what remains is something quieter, something more stable. Presence, not the presence of another person, not the presence of land, but the presence of self. A simple awareness. I am here, nothing more. No future, no projection, no imagined rescue. Just existence, breath, water, sky. And in that simplicity, there is a kind of calm, not comfort, but absence of struggle, because struggle requires direction, and direction is no longer being sought. There are moments when this stillness feels almost peaceful. The movement of the ocean becomes rhythmic, predictable. The body adjusts to it. The mind follows. Thoughts slow. Spacing between them increases until sometimes there are no thoughts at all. Only sensation. The warmth of the sun, the coolness of the water, the subtle rise and fall of the body. And in that space, time becomes irrelevant. Distance becomes irrelevant. Even rescue becomes distant, not rejected, not denied, just no longer actively pursued. And this is the moment that is often misunderstood, because from the outside it may appear like giving up, but from within it is something else. It is the mind finding a way to continue without exhausting itself, to remain without breaking, because constant effort without result leads to collapse. But stillness can be sustained for longer, quietly, without resistance. And sometimes this is what allows a person to last, to reach the moment when something external finally changes. Because when the mind stops searching, it does not stop existing. It simply waits differently, without force, without demand, without expectation. And in that softened state, it becomes ready to receive not what it imagines, but what is real whenever it comes, however it appears. And until then, in the open ocean, beneath a sky that does not answer, there is only this: a body drifting, a breath continuing, a mind no longer reaching, but still quietly there. The mind as the last shore. There is a point when the ocean is no longer outside you, not in the usual way, not as water or waves or distance, but as something that has entered the way you think, the way you feel, the way you perceive everything. After long exposure to the sea, whether on a raft like those from the wreck of the French frigate Méduse, or drifting in open water after the sinking of the USS Indianapolis, there comes a moment when the external world has been reduced to almost nothing. No landmarks, no clear direction, no consistent sound, only repetition, water, sky, breath, and in that repetition, the mind begins to change. At first, it resists. It searches for patterns, for meaning, for anything that resembles structure. It imagines land, creates voices, finds shapes in movement and stories in silence. But as time passes, as each of those creations appears and then disappears, something quieter begins to take form. Not an image, not a sound, but a shift. The realization that everything the mind has been reaching for is no longer outside, that there is no horizon to move toward, no signal to interpret, no external answer waiting to be found. And so it turns not outward, but inward. This is not a dramatic moment. There is no clear beginning, no single thought that defines it. Just a gradual movement, like the tide changing direction. Instead of projecting images onto the horizon, the mind begins to observe itself, its own thoughts, its own rhythms, its own presence. Because when there is nothing left to focus on, attention returns to its source. Breathing becomes more noticeable. Each inhale, each exhale, not as a function, but as an experience. The movement of the body in the water becomes a pattern, something to follow, something to stay with. And in that focus, a kind of stability appears. Not certainty, but continuity. Something that continues, even when everything else has been stripped away. This is where the mind becomes the last shore, not a place you can see, not something you can reach, but something you can remain within. Because even when the ocean offers nothing, the mind still contains something, awareness, a quiet sense of being present. I am here, not tied to time, not connected to direction, just existing. And that existence becomes enough. There are no more imagined islands, no more distant ships, no more voices calling from beyond. Those have come and gone. What remains is simpler, more still, more grounded. A man drifting in the water no longer tries to interpret every movement. He no longer turns at every sound. He no longer scans the horizon for shape. Instead, he stays with the rhythm of his breath, with the movement of the sea, not because he has stopped caring, but because he has found something else to hold on to, something that does not disappear, something that does not depend on the outside world. And in that stillness, something unexpected emerges. Clarity, not the clarity of answers, but the clarity of presence, the understanding that even here, in a place without structure, without certainty, without direction, there is still something stable, not around him, but within him. The mind, which once created illusions to survive, now becomes the place where survival continues without illusion, not by denying reality, but by no longer resisting it, accepting the ocean as it is, endless, unchanging, silent. And in that acceptance, there is less tension, less conflict, less need to force meaning onto what cannot provide it, because meaning has shifted. It is no longer found in reaching land or seeing a ship or hearing a voice. It is found in remaining, in continuing, in being present within the moment as it is. And this is something quiet, something that cannot be seen from the outside. But for those who experience it, it is real as the water, as real as the sky. Because in the absence of everything else, the mind becomes the final place of refuge. Not perfect, not unchanging, but enough to hold on, enough to continue. And sometimes that is the only shore that remains. The quiet return. There is a moment so gentle that it almost feels like nothing has happened. No sudden change, no clear signal, just a shift. After the mind has turned inward, after it has stopped searching, after it has learned to remain within itself, something begins to return, not forcefully, not all at once, but slowly, like light spreading across the horizon at dawn. At first, it is barely noticeable, a sound that feels different from the others, not imagined, not created, but external, real. It does not arrive as meaning. It arrives as sensation, a vibration in the air, a rhythm that does not come from breath or from the movement of water, something separate, something outside. The mind hears it, but does not react immediately because it has heard things before, sounds that were not there, voices that faded, engines that never arrived. And so it waits, not with anticipation, but with caution, listening without reaching. The sound continues, steady, unchanging, and slowly the mind begins to recognize something it had set aside. Pattern, a repetition that does not dissolve, a presence that does not fade. And with that recognition, attention shifts outward again, gently, carefully. The eyes open a little wider. The head lifts just slightly, not searching, just observing. And then a shape appears far away, small, undefined, but consistent. It does not vanish. It does not distort. It remains. And this time, the mind does not rush to interpret it. It does not build meaning around it. It simply allows it to exist. Because after so many illusions, certainty is no longer assumed. It must be confirmed. The shape grows slowly, almost imperceptibly, but enough to create difference, enough to separate itself from the horizon. And then sound and shape align. The rhythm in the air matches the movement in the distance, and something familiar begins to return. Recognition, not as excitement, not as relief, but as clarity. This is not imagined. This is not constructed. This is real. And yet, the response remains quiet because the mind has changed. It no longer reacts with urgency. It no longer reaches outward with force. It receives, it allows, it observes without overwhelming itself, because it has learned something in the silence. That reaction consumes energy. That expectation creates strain, and so it moves differently now. A man lifts his arm, not suddenly, not with urgency, but slowly, deliberately, as if testing the moment, as if confirming that this is happening. Others follow, not because they are told, but because they feel it too. The shift, the return, not of hope, but of reality. And reality feels different, heavier, more defined, less fluid, because it does not change based on perception. It exists, whether or not the mind engages with it, and that difference becomes clear. The shape grows larger, details begin to form, edges sharpen, movement becomes precise, the sound becomes unmistakable, engines mechanical, consistent, not fading, not shifting, and in that moment, the mind completes its return, not abruptly, but fully, from inward to outward, from stillness to engagement. But something remains, a quietness, a softness, because the mind does not return as it was before. It carries something with it, the memory of what it became, of how it adapted, of how it survived when there was nothing left to hold on to. And so, even as rescue approaches, even as the outside world begins to reassemble, the inner world does not disappear. It stays as a kind of echo, a reminder that in the absence of everything else, there was still something, and that something was enough. The ocean begins to change again, not physically, but in perception. The horizon now holds meaning. Distance now leads somewhere. Time begins to move forward again. Measured, structured, recognizable. But beneath that structure, there is a trace of the silence, of the stillness, of the place where the mind had to exist on its own. And perhaps that is what makes the return so quiet, because it is not just a return to the world. It is a return with something carried back, something unseen, something internal, something that remains even after the water is left behind, even after the horizon is crossed, even after everything appears normal again. A quiet understanding that the mind once drifted alone and found a way to come back. What remains after the ocean? There is a part of the journey that does not end when the ocean disappears, because leaving the water does not mean leaving the experience. The body returns first. It is lifted, carried, given water, food, warmth. It responds quickly, instinctively, because the body knows how to recover. But the mind moves differently, more slowly, more quietly. After the survivors of the USS Indianapolis were finally rescued, many could speak. They could describe what had happened. The heat, the thirst, the darkness. They could recall events, moments, details. But there was something else that was harder to explain, something that did not fit easily into words, because what they had experienced was not only external, it was internal, and internal experiences do not always translate clearly. Some spoke of the voices, not as hallucinations, not as confusion, but as presence, something that had been there when nothing else was, something that felt real, even if it could not be confirmed. Others described the visions, land that appeared, then disappeared, shapes that guided them, even if they were not real, not as mistakes, but as moments, moments that had meaning at the time, because they helped, they sustained. They kept the mind moving when the body could not. And even after returning, those moments did not simply vanish. They remained, not always clearly, not always in detail, but as impressions, as sensations, as something felt rather than fully remembered. Some found it difficult to reconnect, not with people, but with structure. Time felt different. It moved too fast or too rigidly, because at sea, time had dissolved. It had become fluid, and returning to clocks, to schedules, to measured days felt unfamiliar, even overwhelming. Others noticed something quieter, a change in how they perceived silence. On land, silence is rarely complete. There are always small sounds, background noise, movement. But after the ocean, those sounds felt louder, more present, because they were no longer competing with endless emptiness. The absence they had experienced had reset something, and now even the smallest sound carried weight. There were also moments when the mind would drift unexpectedly, without warning. A reflection of light on water could trigger something. A long horizon, seen from a distance, could bring back a feeling, not a memory, but a state. The same quiet, the same stillness, the same sense of being suspended between things, not fully here, not fully there. And in those moments, the ocean was present again, not physically, but internally, because once the mind has adapted to that space, it does not forget it completely. It carries it as a kind of imprint, a record, not just of what happened, but of how it felt to exist when everything else was removed. Some found strength in that, a quiet understanding that they had endured something beyond ordinary experience, that they had continued when continuation was uncertain, not through force, but through adaptation, through the ability of the mind to change, to reshape itself, to create what was needed when nothing was given. Others felt something different, not strength, but distance, a subtle separation from everyday life. Because once you have existed in a place without structure, without certainty, without direction, returning to a world full of those things can feel unfamiliar, almost unreal. But over time, something settles, not completely, not perfectly, but enough. The mind begins to reintegrate, to place the experience within the larger story of itself, not as something separate, but as something included, a chapter that does not define everything, but changes something quietly, permanently, because the ocean does not only challenge, it reveals, not about the water, not about the distance, but about the mind, what it can endure, what it can create, what it can become when everything else is taken away. And when the journey ends, what remains is not just survival, it is understanding, a quiet awareness that even in the most empty places, the mind did not disappear. It did not break. It adapted. It continued. It found ways to hold on. And that knowledge stays not loudly, not always clearly, but present, like a distant horizon that you no longer need to reach, but still somehow carry with you. The horizon within. There is something about the ocean that does not leave when you do. Not the water, not the distance, but the way it changed how you see at the beginning of every journey. The horizon feels like a destination, something to reach, something to cross. It holds promise, meaning, direction. But after everything, after the silence, the visions, the voices, the waiting, the horizon becomes something else, not a place, but a reflection, because what you searched for was never only out there, it was also within. The men who survived the raft of the French frigate Méduse, the drifting lifeboats of the RMS Laconia, the open water after the USS Indianapolis, they all experienced something similar, not in detail, not in the same way, but in essence, a moment when the outside world offered nothing and the mind had to respond. At first, it created images of land voices of others, shapes in the water, not as illusion, but as extension, a way to continue when reality did not provide enough. Then it quieted, it stopped searching, stopped reaching, learned to remain, to exist without needing to change what was happening. And finally, it returned, not to what it was before, but to something altered, something that had seen what it is like to exist without structure, without certainty, without direction, and still continue. That is what remains. Not the fear, not the thirst, not the distance, but the understanding that the mind is not passive. It does not simply receive the world. It shapes it, interprets it, responds to it, and when necessary, recreates it, not to escape reality, but to endure it, because endurance is not only physical, it is perceptual. It depends on what you see, what you believe, what you allow to remain. The ocean strips away everything that is not essential, and what is left is simple breath, awareness, presence. And in that simplicity, something becomes clear that you do not need everything to continue. You need enough to hold on to, enough to remain aware, enough to not disappear into the silence. And that enough comes from within, not always strong, not always steady, but present even when everything else is gone. That is the final horizon, not the line where sea meets sky, but the point where the mind meets itself, where it recognizes what it can do, what it can become, what it can endure. And in that recognition, there is something quiet, something stable, not dramatic, not overwhelming, just certain that even in the most empty places, even when there is no land, no sound, no direction, there is still something that remains, something that does not drift, something that does not dissolve, something that does not depend on what is outside the mind, not as a tool, not as a voice, but as a place you carry, a place you return to, a place that becomes your last shore and your first. And when the ocean is gone, when the journey is over, when the horizon is behind you, that place remains quiet, unseen, but always there, like a distant line you no longer need to reach, because you have already become it.